Can you respond to how President Obama is dealing with this crisis in Ferguson?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think people found his original responses to the crisis somewhat lacking. And the pressure of the people, all of these organized, strategic instances of civic unrest, the die-ins, the different marches, and the different sort of ways in which these things are organized across the nation, demand and really command a certain kind of response from the office of the president. And so I think that was the response that you saw yesterday. And obviously, there's a couple of pieces here that I think are important. One, for him to hear people out, to hear the activists on the ground. Note well here, the president is well aware of the challenges that young people of color and poor people face in certain communities with police forces that are charged with protecting and serving them, but ultimately end up containing and terrorizing them. So he's aware of that, but this is important political theater for him because the pressure from the public is what creates space for this administration to move on something like this. And I think that's why you see the policy initiative, some $260 million for community policing, although I think we got to kind of dig deep and see exactly what that training is going to be like. And as you pointed out earlier in the earlier segment, even though we can see changes at the federal level, a lot of these problems are operating at the state level and at the municipal level. And so although the feds can be a model, we are going to need more oversight and a sort of what I refer to as a radical reordering of what local law enforcement looks like in order to see some justice out of some of these instances that we've been dealing with over the last several years, actually.
I want to hone in on some of President Obama's rhetoric and get your response. When he talks about issues of racial injustice, it seems like it's often framed in this language of a subjective emotional experience. In his comments on Monday, I counted the word feel 4 times. He says,
that's right,
young people of color do not feel as if they're being treated fairly. Young people feeling marginalized instead of as an actual reality. Does this language minimize the actual reality of what's happening?
Well, I don't want to minimize the affective nature of these things. It is about how people feel. That's important. But that's not strong enough language, in my opinion, because the reality is a young black person is teenagers 21 times more likely to be murdered at the hands of police. And that's just from the data that we have. That's not a full accounting of the data. That's just the data that we have access to. 21 times more likely to be murdered than his or her white counterparts. That's not a feeling. Those are actual facts. There's data. We have all of these sort of cases that have risen to the level of international sort of media attention, everything from Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner. We can go back into the years and look at other instances of this and see certain names bubble up to the surface. So you have that sort of sensational data, but beneath the surface of that, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these kinds of cases that don't rise to that level of attention. And so that's actual data. People are dying at the hands of law enforcement, and that's not even to take into account the data that we know around stop and frisk, around police stops, period, about police brutality and police harassment. It doesn't take into account a full range of other unfortunate situations when we look at the contact between police forces and the communities with which they're charged to protect. And so there's real data here. This is not just about how people feel. That's not to minimize people's feelings about it, but I think to just talk about the affect is not enough to get at the hardcore data that sort of underwrites all of these issues and problems that we're wrestling with.
On Monday, President Obama said his new task force will come up with concrete recommendations on building public trust in police forces nationwide.
They are going to co-chair a task force that is not only going to reach out and listen to law enforcement, community activists, other stakeholders, but is going to report to me specifically in 90 days with concrete recommendations, including best practices for communities where law enforcement and neighborhoods are working well together. How do they create accountability? How do they create transparency? How do they create trust? And how can we at the federal level work with state and local communities to make sure that some of those best practices get institutionalized?
As President Obama is speaking, he is sitting next to Police Chief Charles Ramsey. That's Charles Ramsey, the commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department. As the police chief of Washington, D.C. in the 2000s, Ramsey faced criticism for the mass arrest of protesters during the meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, a group that brought suits against Ramsey, said, quote, "You'd be hard-pressed to find a more inappropriate choice." Apparently, the Philadelphia police were surprised he was named this. They said they hadn't known about this as he went to Washington, D.C. for these meetings. You're in Philadelphia, Professor Peterson. Can you talk about your response to Charles Ramsey as a choice?
Well, I don't think there are any easy solutions here. You know, Chief Ramsey has had an interesting tenure here in the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia has had its own set of challenges around law enforcement behaving badly. I think for the president's perspective, he wanted to get a law enforcement officer who had some experience in cities that have had these challenges, just so that he would have the bona fides of having the experience of understanding how do you sort of repair some of these issues and challenges. But unfortunately, it's not a strictly law enforcement problem to be solved, right? What Ashley was saying in the previous segment is really, really important here. And again, politicians don't want to hear this, but there's a longer haul here, the long, hard work of working with things like racial bias. There's been a new study out on superhumanization bias, which I think really informs some of these issues. And unless the trust can't be rebuilt.
Explain what you mean by the superhumanization bias.
Well, there's racial bias. People make decisions based upon what their perceptions of race are. But there's new data out around superhumanization bias, where if you go back to the data or the transcript of the grand jury, when you have Darren Wilson referring to Michael Brown as a demon, or referring to him as feeling like he was like Hulk Hogan, or if you think about the reporting around the shooting of Tamir Rice, where they felt that he was a 20-year-old and he's a 12-year-old kid, that's what we might refer to as a superhumanization bias, where whites see black people as literally being superhuman, as being able to endure more pain, as being older than they are, stronger than they are, faster than they are, in some instances more evil or more demonic than they are. And unfortunately, that kind of bias has had some awful consequences once it's really present in an interface between a law enforcement officer and an unarmed civilian. And so those are the kind of complex things that any kind of rebuilding of the trust between the police institutions and communities that are charged with serving and protecting, that's the only way that's going to happen, is if we start to get to the social science behind some of the ways in which people are acting. Now, obviously, we all suffer from biases. Everyone operates based upon biases. It's just that it's much more pronounced when an officer is making a decision between using lethal force and trying to defuse a situation, and they can't see a person for the full human being that they are.